We have been talking about the concept of Itmam-e-Hujja, which is completion of evidence. I talked about this topic in the last session, and I promised to myself that I'm going to present the evidences, arguments from the Quran supporting this concept. But let me first briefly mention a summarized version of what I talked about in the last session. What exactly is the law of completion of evidence, the law of Itmam-e-Hujja? The concept, the understanding says that the Quran tells us that when a messenger comes to a nation, a Rasul, um, and presents the message in such a clear, convincing way that evidence is completed, is established, there remains no doubt in the minds of those people who are presented with the message. Beyond a certain deadline, the Almighty punishes that nation. There is what the Quran calls azab that gets implemented. It happens in different stages. It goes through a process of different stages. It doesn't happen overnight all of a sudden, but it does happen. I mean, it's a promise of the Almighty that whenever a Rasul, a messenger will come, uh, this result is bound to happen. Um, it happens after the messenger is forced and his companions leave the place where he had delivered the message to begin with, and soon after that, uh, it it happens that the uh, nation gets destroyed. It is punished. Uh, the important thing that needs to be understood is obviously what I've said is pretty much clear. But the important thing is that what the Quran mentions in this regard is exclusively meant for the messengers and their times alone. What is mentioned in regard to this law, and it's a detailed mention in the Quran, is not applicable for any other times. It is era specific. You have a right to keep asking, keep criticizing, critically examining this understanding. But the fact of the matter is that if it is acknowledged that the claim is true, then it has some very important, far reaching implications uh, on the way we understand Islam and Islamic teachings. So that is why I picked it as one of the important topics to be discussed. What are the areas where this law, if it is understood, it impacts itself? I mentioned 5 areas. There are many more I can assure you. Number one, uh, the understanding of who is a kafir. I mean, the understanding is a very important, serious understanding. I mean, if what I am presenting, what our point of view is accepted, then the approach of Muslims towards non-Muslims is bound to change. Number two, linked with this understanding is our relationship, the possibility of friendship with the non-Muslims. A third area, a very broad area, which is impacted by the understanding of this law is jihad. The question as to whether Muslims have been required, as is understood by many scholars, and I can tell you, understood by a large number of committed practicing Muslims. Is it really an expectation of the Almighty that as and when Muslims would become powerful militarily, it is a part of their religious duty that they expand, they uh, fight against non-Muslims and dominate and ensure that the message of Islam is not only accepted, it gets the opportunity of getting implemented all over the globe. I've spent something like at least 3 years with this passion as my dream, because there were verses from the Quran that were presented, and I can tell you that there are a large number of Muslims all over the world who have this understanding. If this concept that I'm presenting is accepted, then all those verses are going to be read in a different way. They will have a different meaning. And if what our friends, brothers, and sisters are understanding, then it will carry different meanings. I'm not saying that you accept what I'm saying simply because if you do not accept my point of view, this world is going to become a very troubled place, which already it is, because of the understanding of these Muslims. I don't have to tell you, I don't have to name the groups who are already there doing their best. They're very sincere people. They're prepared to lay down their lives, and they think they're doing it for the Creator, His pleasure. What I'm very humbly submitting is that, uh, you know, it is not desired by the Almighty. He expects from us that we have good relations with everybody and we present the Almighty's message uh, in the best possible manner. So that is also impacted. Another thing, another concept that is impacted by the understanding that I presented last time, and I'll try to present some of its arguments from the Quran today, is the understanding regarding apostasy. There's this famous understanding point of view amongst Muslims that a person who, after having been a Muslim, becomes a non-Muslim is to be killed. I can tell you that there is this near unanimous understanding of Muslims about it. You dare change your religion, you're gone. So we can have hypocrites, we can have so-called Muslim atheists, but we cannot have a declared non-Muslim after he was a Muslim, because here you go. And also impacted by this understanding is the concept regarding blasphemy. If you do not accept what I'm saying and you accept the traditional understanding, any non-Muslim or a Muslim dare speak anything against your religion, which hurts your feelings. Okay, I mean, if you are a law-abiding citizen, probably your law should say that he should be killed. But if you also kill him, you'll do a great job. Nothing wrong with it. But if my understanding, our understanding regarding the law of completion of evidence of the messengers is accepted, then all this is not just unnecessary, it's wrong, it's misleading. So, I mean, I might not be able to convince you, but I think I probably would at least be able to convince you about the fact that it's an absolutely important, serious matter. You can't ignore it. If you don't accept what I'm saying, please refute it by bringing forth arguments from the Quran. And what I'm saying is what the Quran is saying, then what you are doing, defying this understanding, is a serious, objective, a violation of what the Almighty expects from you. So, anyways, this is what is the significance of this law. And now I am going to go about mentioning some of the Quranic arguments. I must admit that they're not very well organized. So, but I hope that I'm going to be able to say things which are going to be put together by your organized minds and will make the presentation later more acceptable and convincing. So I just start with one verse. I'll mention verses after verses. The first verse that I've picked to help understand the concept is verse number 47 of Surah number 10. Surah is Yunus and verse is 47. The Almighty says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وَلِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولٍ. For each nation there was a messenger. فَإِذَا جَاءَ رَسُولُهُمْ. So when their messenger would come, قُضِيَ بَيْنَهُمْ بِالْقِسْطِ. Decision was taken about them. وَهُمْ لَا يُظْلَمُونَ. And they were not treated unfairly. So it's a principle that the Almighty has mentioned. When a Rasul would come to a nation and would deliver the message, then their matter is going to be addressed and sorted out and implemented in this world. And no injustice would be done to them. You might ask this question, although it's not directly relevant to what I'm presenting right now. What does it mean that وَلِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولٍ? For each nation there was a messenger. We don't experience it. Well, what the Quran is saying is, and obviously the Quran expects that when a certain passage of the Quran comes to you and you don't understand it, think about it, investigate, and sooner or later you're about to get the answer. What it means is, and this is what my understanding is, and obviously, understanding the Quran is a collective project. It's my problem, it's your problem, it's the problem of all Muslims, and it's problem or challenge or whatever name or word you use for it. But let's try to understand it. What I understand from this verse is that in the beginning of the journey of humankind, when the population of humankind was very small, and they were living in places, societies, which were not very, they were not at a very great distance from each other. But the means of communication and transportation were not there. I mean, they were hardly there. Very primitive. So the Almighty decided that in case of each of these nations, a messenger would come. And when it would come, deliver the message, and he would be rejected by the nation is going to be done away with. Therefore, the rest of the mankind, me, you, everybody else, we are the progeny of them. We are the progeny of Adam and Eve. We are the progeny of Nuh alayhi salam and his sons. But then obviously later populations were also our ancestors. So no matter wherever humans went, they originated from those particular places, nations, probably somewhere in Central Asia. There were migrations, diaspora, and then, India, China, Europe, northern part of Asia, etc. People spread across everywhere. No matter wherever they went, they actually belonged to one of these nations. And because there was a Rasul that came to their elders, every nation had a Rasul. That's what it means. So, verse number 2. You know what I'm trying to prove? That there is a law, that tells us that Rasul comes, and then when he comes, uh, people who reject him, they are then punished in this very world. Verse number 2. Verse 21 of Surah 58, Al-Mujadila. The Almighty says, Katab Allah. Allah has decided, has written it down. It's a law, it's a policy. La ghlibanna. Most certainly I'm going to prevail, dominate over the enemy. I will, the Almighty says. And then goes on to say, Ana wa rusuli. I and my messengers. Inna Allah qawiyyun aziz. God is powerful, mighty, dominating. So that's what the law is. Let's move to the third verse. This verse is verse 165 of Surah number 4, Surah An-Nisa. The Almighty, after having talked about messengers, some of them, goes on to clarify, Rusulam mubashirina wa munzirin. These were the messengers who were sent, mubashirina wa munzirin, giving good news and warning. لِأَلَّا يَكُونَ لِلنَّاسِ عَلَى اللَّهِ حُجَّةٌ بَعْدَ الرُّسُلِ, so that there remains no excuse for men against Allah. بَعْدَ الرُّسُلِ, after the messengers came. And it says, وَكَانَ اللَّهُ عَزِيزًا حَكِيمًا, and Allah is powerful, wise. So the idea of sending messengers was that they provide people with teachings, evidences, arguments, signs that eventually make sure that everything has been clarified as best as is possible. There remains no doubt in the minds of the people, whether they're accepting it or rejecting it, that this is the truth that they are observing and they are hearing. So nobody can present any excuse before the Almighty that, look, we didn't know it. We're not too sure. Now, if you get the understanding, the spirit of this verse, that God sent messengers who gave good news, who warned. And the result was that evidence was presented to the people most convincingly, and nobody can then make any excuse. You know what it means? Others can present excuse. If you have not received a messenger directly, you have right to say something. What's going to be the eventual outcome? I don't know. God knows. He is the one who knows everything. But for God's sake, do not treat the people who received the message of the messengers directly, the messages directly, do not treat them as the same as other people who receive the message of the Almighty through whom? Through me, through us, with such ordinary poor presentation and ordinary personalities. So there is a difference. Let's move on. Verse number 4. Passage number 4. Verses 76 and 77 of Surah number 17, Surah Bani Israel, Surah Isra. Now it's talking about the practical aspect of this law. So you know what the Quran does is that, as we have seen in the first 3 verses, it mentions the principle and it clarifies it over and over again. And then it also mentions the application of this principle in the form of the stories of messengers, particularly the story of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I remember I mentioned while talking about the principles you must keep in mind while reading the Quran to understand it properly, that don't ever forget that the Quran from A to Z, from beginning till end, is the saga, the story of the messengers, the last messengers in Zar, the way he warned his nation. So, these principles are then implemented. So here is a mention of the implementation of that principle, that law. It says, وَإِنْ كَادُوا لَيَسْتَفِزُّونَكَ مِنَ الْأَرْضِ. And, O Prophet, they were indeed about to drive you from the land, from Mecca. They are about to do it, the way they are behaving with you. لِيُخْرِجُوكَ مِنْهَا, so that they expel you, evict you from it. وَإِذًا لَا يَلْبَثُونَ خِلَافَكَ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. And in that case, the Quran says, and in that case, they will not be allowed to survive there after you, except for a very short while. If they force you to migrate, then they will not survive. As I said, the messenger migrates and the punishment comes. This is what the Quran says. And you know what it goes on to say? سُنَّةَ مَنْ قَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا قَبْلَكَ مِنْ رُسُلِنَا. Why would they not survive? This is our established sunnah policy for those we sent before you. And the Quran goes on to say, وَلَا تَجِدُ لِسُنَّتِنَا تَحْوِيلًا. And you will not find our policies changing. It's a sunnah, it's a policy, it's a law which never ever gets violated. The Almighty is always consistent in applying His policies. So that's is another aspect of the law, the way it was implemented. The same thing has been mentioned in another verse number 30, surah number 8. وَإِذْ يَمْكُرُ بِكَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا لِيُثْبِتُوكَ أَوْ يَقْتُلُوكَ أَوْ يُخْرِجُوكَ وَيَمْكُرُونَ وَيَمْكُرُ اللَّهُ وَاللَّهُ خَيْرُ الْمَاكِرِينَ. And remember, O Prophet, when those who disbelieved plotted against you to arrest you, kill you, or evict you from Mecca, they were planning. وَيَمْكُرُونَ وَيَمْكُرُ اللَّهُ. And Allah too was planning. And Allah is the best of planners. So He had a plan. I mean, if they are going to force you to go away, then they're not going to survive. They're not going to survive. So that was his strategy. Now, how does it happen that the messenger is able to deliver the message in a way that it becomes absolutely clear? There are many factors. His, personality, charismatic, impressive, and caring. His message is clear, and it's confidently put across. He's confident and yet he's humble. Everybody can see from his face that this man is nothing but truth, reliable, as-sadiq, truthful, al-amin, trustworthy. But on top of that, the Quran says, verse 125, surah number 16, Ud'u ila sabili rabbika bil hikmah. O messenger, invite towards the path of your Lord with wisdom. Wal maw'izatil hasana, and good advice. Wajadilhum billati hiya ahsan, and debate, argue with them in a nice manner. Honestly, I see here in the West many impressive Muslim speakers, but in many cases they're just trying to demolish the people they disagree with. I mean, that's not what we're supposed to do. Just talk to them, invite them. They're quite as passionate about their religion as you are passionate about your religion. So the Prophet ﷺ was informed that just, be wise in your presentation and give good advice. And if you have to debate, discuss, do it in a nice manner. The Quran, as I said earlier, is full of these stories of messengers who went through the same process. And, the law of completion of evidence can be seen in those stories. And imagine, why these stories we see are mentioned over and over again. There are people who actually uh, they complain. They say, why is it that same thing? Sometimes uh, stories described in detail, sometimes it's brief, and so on. The reason is quite obvious that this is a book of Inzar, it's warning. And there was a nation that was about to be punished likewise. And this punishment was to then remind people of the day of judgment. This whole story, this whole saga, when understood and internalized, would make you believe in Allah confidently, properly, deeply. Hereafter, you'll be convinced the veracity of the claim of the Prophet ﷺ and the Quran, you'll be convinced. So the more you read, the more you understand, and the more you are able to confirm. So these stories are all over the Quran, but there are 4 important surahs wherein they are mentioned in more detail. Surah Al-Araf, Surah number 7, from verses 59 to 137. Very long passage, talking about 6 messengers that were talked about over and over again. Nuh, Hud, Saleh, Lut, Shoaib, Musa, alayhi salam. There are others too. Sometimes Ibrahim alayhi salam, sometimes Yunus alayhi salam. But these 6 are mentioned over and over again. So Surah Araf 59, 137, Surah Hud, Surah number 11, verse 25 to verse 100. Long passage. Surah Shu'ara, Surah number 26, verse 10 to verse 191. The entire length, And then, relatively briefly, Surah 54, Surah Al-Qamar, from verse 9 to verse 43. Okay, in Surah Qamar, after narrating their stories relatively briefly, the Quran says, "Akuffarukum khairum min ulaikum?" Are your disbelievers, O Quraysh, any better than those before them? Am lakum baratun fi zubur? Or your tribe have immunity written in the scriptures for yourselves. That is, why is it that while other nations were destroyed and punished by the Almighty for the crime of rejecting the message of the messengers, your people are not going to be punished? They are bound to be punished. That's what the Quran is saying. So, this is what the Quran keeps emphasizing over and over again. In Surah Tawbah, Surah number 9, the Almighty says something which I need to briefly first mention. This punishment of the Almighty would come either in the form of natural calamities, as indeed was the case of most of the earlier nations, or if the companions of a messenger would be large in number, then it would be a punishment inflicted upon the enemy through the swords, the military might of the companions. And this is exactly what Surah Tawbah says, Surah number 9, verse 14. Yu'azzibhumullahu bi'aydikum. O believers, God is going to punish them through your hands. What else should God say to clarify it? If there is something still left unclear, then let's look at the next verse. Verse 17 of Surah Al-Anfal, talking about the Battle of Badr. I said, it's the implementation of this law that you find in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. In the Battle of Badr, the Almighty says of believers, وَلَمْ تَقْتُلُوهُمْ. You didn't kill them. وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ قَتَلَهُمْ. It was Allah who killed them. Allah had to punish them. So He punished them through you. Now, as I said earlier, this punishment came about because of reasons. But before that, I mentioned another passage, which is verse 4 of Surah Muhammad, Surah number 47. The Almighty says, and the Almighty actually raises a very valid point, a question that comes to one's mind. And that's the beauty of the Quran. Sometimes you're reading the Quran and you read it and you say, oh, goodness me, yeah, this is a good question. It actually was in my mind as well. The question is, I mean, um, why could not there be natural calamities in this case as well? Honestly, the task would have been, I don't know, it would have been much easier. Now it's become difficult because we explain to the people that what is mentioned in the Quran regarding killing the disbelievers is actually a law. But, it's a challenge to explain it to them. Had it been some natural calamities, some flood, earthquake, lightning, right, what I mean, simple. But the Almighty says, verse 4, Surah Muhammad, وَلَوْ يَشَاءُ اللَّهُ, had it been Allah's will, لَن تَصَرَ مِنْهُمْ, He could have taken revenge from them Himself. But وَلَكِنْ لِيَبْلُوَ بَعْضُكُمْ بَعْضًا, but He asked you to fight, to test some of you by means of others. So it's a test of the people who believe, to prove that their belief was firm, that they actually become the tools of the Almighty, His weapons to implement the punishment. Very briefly now, in a little time left, while my boss looking at me and telling me that you have to finish it within time, the person who is a kafir is the one who is punished, and the kafir is a person who knows it. I mean, he knows it, that is the truth, and he is rejecting it. So a few verses. Verse number 20 of Surah Al-An'am, Surah number 6, says, Allazina atainahumul kitab, those whom we gave the book, yarifunahu kama yarifuna abna'ahum, they recognize him, the messenger, quite the same way as they recognize their own sons, their own children. So it's quite as clear as that. And then the Quran goes on to say in verse 14 of Surah An-Naml, Surah number 29, when Musa alayhi salam presented his signs to Pharaoh and his companions, the Quran says, وَجَحَدُوا بِهَا, they rejected them. وَاسْتَيْقَنَتْهَا أَنفُسُهُمْ, even though they were convinced about them being true. وَاسْتَيْقَنَتْهَا, they had yaqeen, they were convinced that this man is God's messenger. He's not an ordinary person. So why did they reject them? ظُلْمًا وَعُلُوًّا, out of injustice and arrogance. The Quran also says, in the Quran, verse 109 in Surah Al-Baqarah, they rejected مِن بَعْدِ مَا تَبَيَّنَ لَهُمُ الْحَقِّ, even after the truth became absolutely clear to them. So this law of evidence, completion of evidence of the messengers, is written all over the Quranic text. May the Almighty enable us to understand His message properly, and may He enable us to be able to convince others and to practice His message to the best of our ability.